It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to our 22nd webinar in the Coffee With series, sponsored by the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership at Seton Hall University. I'm Reggie Lewis, the Executive Director of the Greenleaf Center, and it's great to greet you all from across the country who've logged on this afternoon to take part in our conversation with Dr. Ami Bera, U.S. Representative for California's 6th District. The Coffee With series provides the center the chance to showcase the inspirational stories of servant leaders and the endless ways in which individuals, organizations, and society in general can be transformed by the power of servant leadership, a philosophy in which the leader first seeks to serve, which is why we're so fortunate to have Representative Bera with us today. He's the embodiment of servant leadership in action. Our conversation with the Congressman this afternoon will cover such areas as the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., bridging divides, and the promise of bipartisanship. In a few minutes, we will, of course, formally introduce our distinguished guest. But before we proceed any further, a quick word about the Center for Servant Leadership. For nearly 60 years, the center has worked to promote the awareness, understanding, and practice of servant leadership. In addition to the Coffee With series, other core programs include the annual Public Policy Lecture, which features thought leaders and issue experts from a range of sectors applying a servant leader's lens to a challenging policy topic. The Greenleaf Scholars, which funds researchers promoting the efficacy and impact of servant leadership. The center also exposes high school and college students to opportunities to develop lives of service through our Next Generation initiative. And through our outside engagements, we proudly work closely with organizational partners as they implement the practice of servant leadership throughout their workplace culture. Now, the moment we've all been waiting for. It is indeed my honor to now formally introduce today's guest, the Honorable Dr. Ami Bera, U.S. Representative of California's 6th Legislative District. Dr. Bera has represented Sacramento County's 6th District since 2013 and is currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic. As a first-generation American born and raised in California, Congressman Bera attended the University of California, Irvine, where he earned his BS and MD degrees. During Dr. Bera's medical career, he held various leadership roles, which eventually catapulted him to serve as Sacramento County's Chief Medical Officer. Congressman Bera is the longest-serving Indian American of Congress, who has not only worked tirelessly to serve the nearly 750,000 residents of California's beautiful District 6, but has also been a sorely needed voice for greater civility and bipartisanship on behalf of the American people. Okay, Congressman Bera, do you have your mug ready? All right.
I do have a Seton Hall dad mug, but it's in my office. For
Yes.
daughter is class of 2019.
That's right. I am aware of that Seton Hall Daddy's mug, and we are proud to claim you as a Seton Hall parent, and just thrilled that you could make time for us today. I'm also going to make the audience aware, just a quick note, that you too will have a chance to interact with our esteemed congressman. So please go ahead and begin to load up the Q&A chat feature. But let's begin, Congressman, with our first category, formative years and career milestones. And you have many, many career milestones. But what are some of your fondest memories of childhood, and what was the motivating factor that led you to pursue the medical profession?
I mean, there's probably not one single motivating factor. I was certainly blessed to be raised in a very close-knit family. My parents immigrated from India, as you mentioned. My dad immigrated in 1958. My mom came 1 year after that with my oldest brother in 59. So, grew up in kind of that traditional immigrant household. At that time, growing up in the 1960s, there wasn't that much of an Indian American community. So it was just kind of thrust into a regular childhood as an American kid, doing Cub Scouts, Weeblos, Boy Scouts, playing sports, and just grew up in this fabric of a tight community in Downey, California, and Southern California. Around the late 60s, early 70s, when you had immigration reform take place, my aunts, uncles, cousins started immigrating from India and started to get to know that side of my cultural heritage, which I really didn't have a deep understanding of, and saw that vibrancy. So again, I think I was lucky to be surrounded with love and relatives and so forth. And I say that because when I look at challenges that other individuals and face, I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we face today is kind of that breakdown of community, a sense of community. And when I was blessed to have a family, but I was also blessed to have a strong community around me as well. And I think that's one of the most important things. So when you talk about formative things, I was kind of raised to think that you can do whatever you want, take a chance, and you may try this and not be successful here, but it opens up this door over here, and that's something that has stuck with me.
Well, there's nothing like having a strong, loving community, in addition to a large extended family supporting us as we um, seek and find our way throughout society. And that support in shaping you is one reason why we're all benefiting from your great work today. Which is why I'm going to put the next question into some perspective to help our audience to understand that there are 1.6 million people who reside in Sacramento County. And you, Dr. Bera, you were the chief medical officer, the top public health official for 1.6 million people. When you look back now, what's the one troubling public health challenge that required you and your team to engage and build community in order to resolve that issue?
I think it's it was certainly the challenge back when I was chief medical officer, and it still is a challenge today. Is that there still were large numbers of individuals who had no access to healthcare or very little access to healthcare. So we ran the safety net clinics, and our system of care probably had capacity to care for about 40,000 unique individuals. And when we did, our analysis, there were probably 225 to 250,000 individuals that had no place to go get that care. So they would go to the emergency room, they would get really episodic care, but they would only seek that care when they got really sick. And often it cost a lot more, it was more complicated, and sometimes disease had progressed too far where you had, that you just couldn't reverse it. So I think that would be the first thing is we spend way too much on the back end caring for the person once they've had the heart attack. We spend way too little on the front end saying, hey, can we make small investments here to help prevent that heart attack or identify that cancer early on or treat that diabetes? And I think that's part of the reason why healthcare spending in the United States is so out of control, right? And if we could just shift a little bit to say, hey, let's go to the front end, practice preventive medicine, create healthier lifestyles, address access on the front end, I think we would save a lot of money on the back end. Now, it's from a policy perspective, it's not really easy to shift that because a lot of people are making a lot of money on this back end delivery system, but it's not sustainable.
Clearly, the push for more preventative care, getting away from episodic care, is how we nurture a healthier society. Um, your work as a successful medical practitioner arguably gave you every incentive to stay right where you were in California, beautiful District 6. And one can only imagine the additional headaches and the strain, quite frankly, on the quality of life for you and your family to carry out your duties in DC. And so, particularly when you think about the bi-coastal travel alone, that has to be extremely strenuous. So I promised some friends in the audience that I would definitely ask you what led to that shift to Congress.
There's not one single event, but probably a series of events. I was always politically engaged, going back to college and, in my role as chief medical officer. And then I was dean of admissions at UC Davis's medical school. After that, I knew all our local electeds, our members of Congress, and would advise them on healthcare policy, but also it's easy to do the easy things, but it's necessary to have the difficult conversations. And I think far too often elected officials disappointed me when they,
Mm.
didn't engage in those difficult conversations. And then, the senator from Illinois decided to run for the presidency back in
Yeah.
2007, and pretty early on got involved in his campaign fundraising and trying to help out. Back when my wife's African American, and even she was like, he's not going to get elected. It's going to be Hillary Clinton. Maybe folks remember John Edwards. Um, but it's like, no, there's something about this guy. He's got an energy and an optimism, and he's only a couple years older than me too, so someone I can relate to. And then Barack Obama, lo and behold, got elected to the presidency, and I knew he was going to work on healthcare. So it's really easy to take pot shots from the outside and say, hey, you ought to be doing more, you ought to be doing better. But I had the ability to get in the game, and so put myself out there. It was a crazy notion. I'd never run for anything before, and like folks were like, you'd be a great member of Congress. Why don't you run for city council? It's like, well, no, I want to work on healthcare. I want to work on some of these issues that I care about, and I think you've got to do it at the federal level. I ran and lost in 2010,
Ah,
but had certainly loved the process, getting out there, talking to folks, hearing what their concerns were, and trying to give voice to those concerns. Ran again in 2012 and got elected.
and we're glad that you didn't give up. And I didn't know I should have figured out that a big motivation was certainly tied to our former president. So yes, we can, and you are proving that we can indeed. And certainly we need to have conscientious leaders at that federal level to push forward the important work on behalf of the country. We are, as we discussed in prep for today, going to talk about the legacy of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, since we're still in the month of January when we traditionally honor his life. Obviously, he was, after all, the quintessential servant leader. What lessons might be drawn from the legacy of a life, a man who really gave us so much more than a speech calling for a dream, as important as that was? But he also reminded us of the dangers of the dangers of the three isms: militarism, racism, and materialism. Your thoughts on that rich legacy?
Yeah, so I mean, he was much more than just a dream, right? He was a person of action, certainly a person of moral conscience, and um, really did talk about, as you said, the three isms. They're very much alive and well today. We
Unfortunately.
see. Um, I would have hoped when I got elected to Congress in 2012 and then sworn in 2013 that we would actually be in the 21st century moving to a more peaceful and um, interactive world, one that was more connected. Um, we've gone in the opposite direction, and you've seen several really disturbing. Certainly you saw the impact of the Great Recession, but then you saw the pandemic and that impact, and then for the first time since World War II, you have big country war with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that really has you know tip things off, and now you have a second hot conflict in the Middle East. And we are doing everything we can. I spent last week in the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan, and the goal there is we want to avoid a third conflict in Asia. So
Yes.
how do we rise to our better nature? And I think that's what Dr. King would have wanted out of us. How do we find a more compassionate soul where we see our brothers and sisters for who they are, and meet them where they are at? And then on that materialism one, I think that is a big one, because I do think, again, just my opinions, going back to the 1980s, we became a culture of greed, right? So, I'm not sure who's on the webinar, but if you remember that movie Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, Greed is Good. I think that's killing us, right? I think we've become a consumptive society. So, we're consuming much more than what we need, whether that's, media, whether that's our dietary. So, whereas, so how do we turn that around, right? And some of that is that materialism. Like, we don't need most of the stuff that we have, and again, not easy, because a lot of people are making a lot of money pushing us to consume. I'd say the same thing happens in healthcare, where we're pushed to consume a lot more healthcare than we actually need. And like, I don't know that changes with my generation that kind of came of age in the 80s, but for the kids that are in college right now, that Gen Z generation, I think they see the world a little bit differently. And that may be the shift that's coming.
And the recent outcry on behalf of our young people, including some on this campus, who are calling for this nation to rise to the occasion in a way in which we can take on a more moral stance in response to some of the events in the Middle East. Take me now to my next question as a part of this segment on Dr. King. You no doubt are aware of this morning's front page coverage at the New York Times, in which they feature an article about a coalition of 1,000 Black pastors, including some prominent ministers from the great state of California, who are coalescing around this call on the Biden administration to bring about a ceasefire with the Israeli-Hamas war. If Dr. King were alive today, where do you think he'd be on that issue?
I mean, I think Dr. King's heart would ache for the loss that the families suffered on October 7th. And his heart would ache for the folks that are still hostages post October 7th. But I think his heart would equally ache watching innocent children, watching the death and destruction taking place post October 7th. And I know where I'm really pushing a lot of my energy is we are facing a humanitarian crisis right now, but it is about to get really bad in terms of starvation, lack of clean water. That existed before October 7th, but it is devastating right now. And to me, that's not war. That is absolutely preventable. So we have to do everything we can to safely get food, water, medications, supplies in to prevent what could be tens of thousands of additional preventable deaths. And again, that's not war. And I think Dr. King would say as much. So in order to do that, you do have to have a cessation of the fighting so that you can get those necessary supplies in. And then you do have to think about the day after, which is how can you create something different? Like, just going back to what existed before October 7th is not a solution. Can you create a place where the Israeli population can live and feel secure, but can you also create a place where the Palestinian citizens can live with respect and dignity? And a life that they can live as well. Dr. King had a dream, and I think we have to dream and visualize what that looks like. Now, it's not going to be easy because you have to have willing partners on both sides. But I think there's an opportunity to, out of this despair, to try to create something better. But first, we do have to, avert this humanitarian crisis. In order to do that, you have to stop the fighting.
It is refreshing to hear from you and other public officials to remind us that suffering is, in fact, that is preventable. And yet, at the same time, if we fail to reimagine something that's different in the post-war, the aftermath of the conflict, then we might very well end up in the same place again, unfortunately. You also know, and thank you for your thoughts on that, Dr. Bera, that Dr. King clearly was about building broad coalitions. And one reason why you have big fans here at Seton Hall, not just because your daughter is an alum, is because we have watched and tracked you and your quest over the years to build broad coalitions. And that takes us to our next category, bridging the divide. You've been there, you've been serving since 2013. From your vantage point, you're right there on the inside. What speaks to this the growing divisions at the federal level as well as the nation as a whole? Have we ever been this polarized?
Um, People always point to the Civil War,
Right.
saying, "Well, it's been worse before," but it is pretty bad. But I don't think it's as bad as it looks when folks are looking at cable news and so forth. I would still say the majority of members, Democrats and Republicans, act with some level of civility. Now, I would say the parties have changed, where the power structure is and the incentives, whereas maybe 40 or 50 years ago, the incentive really was to get stuff done. I think right now, the incentive to stay in power is to make the other side fail. And that's not leadership. That's not like we should be the United States of America. And how I think about it is I'm a reflection of my constituents, the 750,000 or so folks that I represent in Sacramento County in District 6. If that's the case, I have to accept the fact, and I'll just use Marjorie Taylor Greene because we are very different people, but she's been elected and reelected. I have to accept the fact that she's probably a reflection of her constituents in Georgia. So, as a person of faith, we're taught not to judge other, but try to understand other. That certainly has served me well as a doctor in the health profession. And I think that's how I'm trying to approach my colleagues, is they may see a really different world than I do, but can I find it within myself, not to judge them, but to try to understand them? What's motivating them? What are their constituents seeing? What are they feeling? And then maybe if I ground myself in and root myself kind of in that consciousness, I can start to understand where they're coming from, and we can look for common ground. And that's something that I certainly tried to teach my medical students, but it is something that I try to carry forward here. So, not to judge other, but try to understand other and then come together. And right now, I think, I may be the rarity, because I do think there's a lot of, if you're not on my team, then you're on the wrong team. And that's not the case.
Clearly. And when you think about how the American people are looking at the work of Congress and the work of the federal government in general, I just want to share this data point that my team has put together here. And this is a recent report, September 2023, from the Pew Research Center, that cites fewer than 2 in 10 Americans trust their government to do what is right. fewer than 2 in 10 Americans trust their government to do what is right. How then, Dr. Bera, might Congress begin to reestablish trust among the American people? What's the path forward?
I mean, the path forward is to become servants, right? That's why your institution exists. It is about serving first, right? I mean, we're not elected for to serve our own interests. We're elected to serve the people that we represent, as well as the nation that we have the privilege of representing. And I think getting back to that culture of service would be a big first step, right? Because at the end of the day, our legacy should not be whatever titles we accumulate. Our legacy should be is what impact did we have on those that we were elected to serve. Now, it saddens me to think only 20% of folks trust their government. Now, I think if you were to ask the question, do you have faith in your member of Congress? The results would be very different because they would say, yeah, I like my member of Congress and trust my member of Congress, but I don't like what's happening in Washington, D.C. And we see that since we have to run every 2 years. That said, it should sadden all of us as members of Congress. We should want that number to be 80%.
Absolutely.
And we ought to do everything we can to try to fix that.
Absolutely. Now our last category, before we open up to the general Q&A, and building on your comments about how we get from perhaps the 20 to 80%, one might argue that that might be found in the promise of bipartisanship. And so when you think about the troubling data point we just mentioned, there's also that general, as you've heard this before, you hear it all the time, that the feeling amongst our fellow citizens that the level of dysfunction, the lack of civility, particularly in the last quarter of 2023, it just promotes the sense that there's just nothing that can ever get done. I wanted to flip that a bit and build on our first chat together recently here at the center with you, because you helped us to understand that there are some things that are happening. There are some positive things that are happening. Can you say more about those things that might not be captured by the media and why there is some realistic hope, Dr. Bera, for bipartisanship?
So let's start with the media, right? The media is very different than it was, Reginald, when you and I were growing up, right? We were a family that watched Walter Cronkite, but
Yep.
we had three, maybe four, including PBS. You had ABC, NBC, and CBS. But it really didn't matter which news program you were watching. It essentially was the same news, just a different anchor. And it was objective. They were just delivering the news. That isn't the world we live in today. If you're more conservative, you're watching Fox. If you're a little bit more progressive, you're watching MSNBC and CNN somewhere in the middle there. But you're not getting objective data necessarily. You're getting, if you're conservative and you're watching conservative cable news, it's just reinforcing ideas that you probably already had. And news has become a little bit more entertainment as well. So you're covering the more performative artists of Congress, and less the folks that just kind of keep their head down and are trying to do their work. Because that's not good television. It doesn't get good ratings. And so I think that's part of it. And then layer in social media, TikTok, everything else. And that's something that we've got to figure out, because it's hard to explain foreign policy in a 30-second TikTok video.
That's right.
We have to understand, I think that is where a lot of our younger citizens are getting a lot of their information. So since I'm talking to a university, I think it behooves us both in our K through 12 education, but certainly in our academic centers, to do more critical thinking skills, so that folks, as they're getting that information, not just accepting it as fact, but also are trying to understand those issues But on the, how do we break through here? We're actually getting stuff done, right? I mean, think about the last Congress and what we passed. Historic legislation with regards to infrastructure bill, historic legislation with regards to starting to build the resiliency to address climate change. Um, this historic legislation to start to be able to negotiate prescription drug prices, bring down the price of insulin and things like that. So a lot got done. And for all the chaotic, you know, battles around the speakership and vacating the speakership, and it looks chaotic, the government's still running. We haven't shut down. To Speaker Johnson's credit, um, he's put the legislation that's been necessary on the floor, that has then passed with the majority of Democrats and the majority of Republicans voting together to get things done. And that may be the beginning of the healing process, because in a narrow majority, and right now the Republicans just have a 2-seat majority, they can only afford to lose 2 votes. You have to learn how to work with the other side, because otherwise 8 extremists on either party can hold the whole institution hostage. Or you could say, you know what, I'm going to cut you 8 who are never going to vote for anything anyways off, and I'm going to go find some Democrats to work with. And I say that I'm a Democrat. I hope we get the majority back in the next Congress, but we won't have a 30-seat majority. We might have, if we have a great night, we might have a 5-seat majority. So we are going to have to learn how to work together to get stuff done for the country. And that might be the forcing function.
Absolutely. Must learn how to work across the aisle. And your word, being a man with healing hands, reminding us of the importance of healing, necessary even at the governmental level. I am being pressured by some aggressive young people here to turn this over now to the Q&A portion. And they're going to stop our chat, Dr. Bera, unfortunately, or at least for now. But it's my pleasure to bring on Gabrielle Cooper, our brilliant project manager here at the Greenleaf Center, who will now facilitate the next portion of our program. Gabby.
Thank you, Reggie, and thank you, Dr. Bear, for taking the time to be here with us today. Before we go to the Q&A feed, I want to remind the audience that we're going to get there, but please start submitting your questions. Just before that, we have Sonder Dawson here with us today, a freshman at Seton Hall University who happens to be from the Congressman's home state of California. Sonder is studying mathematical finance, information technology, management, and philosophy. Among his many leadership roles on campus include serving as president of both the AI and the investment bank clubs. And he is here with us today to kick off our open Q&A. So Sonder, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you so much, Representative, for being here. My question sort of touches on something that we kind of alluded to at the end, talking more about the younger generation. I know Dr. King sort of emphasized passing the torch as something quintessential to progress in general. How would you sort of advise like my generation to be able to like engage in civic life, to bridge the divides and really get involved with politics in general?
Yeah, so I think, so I had the pleasure of serving with someone who served with Dr. King, John Lewis. And, John Lewis was the soul of Congress in and he served as a mentor to many of us. But he would say, it's important to show up. So that's the first thing. You got to show up. So if there's things that you're passionate about or that you're seeing or you want to change, you got to show up. But he would also say, it's not enough to just show up. You got to speak up too. And so you have to get involved where you can. And that would be the first thing, is showing up, and then showing up and speaking up and getting involved. And the world is changing rapidly. Sandra, I think in the introduction, they said you're part of the AI group. Well, that's all changing really rapidly. I already talked about how a lot of your generation, gets their information off of TikTok. That's not my generation. right? That's not, I'm not a big social media guy or on Instagram or on TikTok, but you guys are. And it's going to be your world. So how do we start passing that torch off to you and meeting your generation in this rapidly changing world that's much more interconnected? How do we understand the challenges that your generation, the things that shape many of of your generation, the Great Recession, which really, created a lot of challenges that you probably saw your parents go through. And then, the pandemic, I don't think we're yet grasping the impact that it had on young people. I used to go do some of the remote high school classes, and I would just watch those kids on Zoom, and that's not high school, right? That's when you should be in your formative years, building those relationships and growing into a young adult. So we're going to need your generation's help thinking about how do we navigate this, right? How do we not just rebuild what we had before, but build what your generation wants? Climate change is coming at us really rapidly. I don't think my generation is adept enough at the tools that we need to use to address those issues. So we do need your generation. I look at two of my colleagues that, all of you are going to know, AOC. And she's masterful at, whether you agree with her policies or don't agree with her policies, she's masterful at communicating with the next generation. Right? We ought to be tapping into that. That's where you guys can be really helpful. And now the first Gen Z member of Congress, Maxwell Frost, really thoughtful, got engaged around gun violence, right? Because of what happened in Florida, and took that activism, and now is a member of Congress. I think he's 26 now. So show up, speak up, and cause good trouble. That was the third thing that John Lewis would like. You got to make trouble, but make it good trouble. So.
Okay, thank you. I had another question, sort of in a broader spectrum. I know, as a Californian representing very diverse constituents, what challenges do you face in making sure that everyone's voices are heard, on the national political stage, and how do you navigate those challenges to ensure that your constituents feel represented?
Yeah, so like my district is incredibly diverse. We have the largest population of Afghan refugees in the country in my district, and we have a history of, we have got a large Ukrainian refugee population, then going back to the Vietnam era, a lot of Hmong Mien Vietnamese refugee population. I think you've got to listen to everyone and try to integrate around shared values. And how do you do that? Because we also have communities that have been there for long periods of time that also feel neglected. And how do you bridge that gap? How do you share common understanding, and then represent those diverse viewpoints? Now, you're not always going to make everyone happy, because you can't be everything to everyone, but you have to understand why you're taking the positions that you are, and be willing to show up and kind of explain your positions. So, but I think it starts with listening. So.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sonder, and thank you, Dr. Bera, for those thoughtful answers. We have one question in the chat so far, and that comes from Mel Grazada, and they're asking, what would Dr. Martin Luther King say about AI and its impact on people, their lives, and work?
I think Dr. King would say the same thing about AI that he would probably say about social media. That's not reality. They might be tools that allow us to communicate in the, when we're talking about social media, or AI, it might be a tool that allows us to be more efficient in the work that we're doing, but it shouldn't replace the personal connection. It shouldn't replace going out and connecting with folks. and creating that sense of community, that sense of human connection, that we're all in this together. So I think that's one thing that Dr. King might say. Another thing that, I'm not afraid of AI. I think it's something that we should understand. It's not going away. So how do we use AI to help address some of the challenges that we face? I think a lot of folks are worried, well, computers are going to kick me out of a job. And what I'd say is, well, what if our workday was only 4 days a week and the fifth day was a day of service? That's not a bad thing.
Not at all.
5 days a day where you can go volunteer in your kids' elementary school. How's that bad? It gives you, so I think we shouldn't be afraid of it. I think we should try to understand it. And if it allows us to feed other aspects of our lives, to do something that nourishes our soul, how is that a bad thing?
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you. All right, so I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. I guess we can start wrapping up here. I want to take a moment to give some center announcements very quickly. So here we go. So on February 21st, we will be hosting a lunchtime chat with Alex Core and Graham Honecker. We'll be discussing their new book, A Blessing, Not a Burden. We are also kicking off 2024 with 2 Foundations of Servant Leadership courses. Registration for the class that begins tomorrow is now closed. However, we have a few remaining seats in the course that starts in mid-February. So you can use the QR codes on the screen to access more information, as well as go to greenleaf.org/Greenleaf Academy. If you would like to stay connected with the Greenleaf Center, please use our QR codes on the screen here to see what this center has to offer. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who logged on today. If you could please take a moment to fill out the brief Zoom survey, we would deeply appreciate that. And I know Reggie has some more final few words for us.
Well, again, thank you all for joining us today. We wish we actually had more time, but we have a very busy representative from the 6th District. Dr. Bera, this has been truly insightful and a huge blessing for us here to have you with us today. Thank you for making time to be with us, but also thank you for your service to our nation and just all the ways in which you foster empathy and healing to build a better society. We're all fortunate for the work that you do every day. I just wish we had more time, and we'll figure out between Louis and Aisha and your magnificent team a way to get you back here for one of our center programs. Again, thank you, everyone. Complete those surveys, and we'll see you the next time for the next webinar.